you know, many people would have not have even known that there was any civil society to begin with in Iran. What is your report concentrating on, and what conclusion do you draw?
The report, Christiane, is essentially about the slow strangulation of civil society in Iran. Unlike many of its neighbors, Iran has actually had a very vibrant civil society, especially during Khatami, former President Khatami's era. Unfortunately, that has changed quite a bit. Both with the start of the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, but also in particular as a result of the crackdown that happened following the 2009 disputed elections.
So in about 97 to about 2003, there was a flowering of journalism, of all sorts of things.
That's correct. There was not only a flowering of journalism, but there was also quite a few non-governmental organizations, also human rights activists, and lots of human rights lawyers who were extremely active during Khatami's era, and also political dissidents and political opposition members who were very active at that time.
So that started to be reversed in 2005 with the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad?
I would say that actually started to reverse earlier than that. It was the second term of Khatami is really when the conservatives kind of had a backlash, and you started to see new constraints on civil society. A lot of newspapers started to close down. But after 2005, when President Ahmadinejad became the president, things really started to get worse. And of course, we know what happened in 2009.
Well, I was there for the elections of 2009, but give us the facts and figures of what you call uncivil society, or the decimation of civil society there. What does that look like?
Well, what it looks like, Christiane, is that many civil society members, activists, especially human rights activists, were thrown in prison. After the 2009 elections in particular, the government used the elections as an excuse to essentially go after any sort of dissent and opposition in the country. That meant going after independent NGOs, it meant going after independent journalists who were critical of the government, and it meant going after human rights activists. Many of them were imprisoned, arbitrary arrests and detentions. Many of them were detained in secret detention facilities, tortured often, and put in solitary confinement. They did not have access to lawyers. Oftentimes they were tried in revolutionary courts in extremely unfair trials and sentenced to 5, 10, 15, 20 years in prison sometimes, essentially for doing their job, essentially for speaking out against the government and its actions.
Let's talk about the case of Sattar Beheshti, who was a young blogger, and his story is well known. He died in detention, and he said that before he died, he had sent a message that he had been tortured and badly abused. The Iranian authorities took some action.
They did. They did take some action. I think part of the reason was the outcry, frankly, from international human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and other organizations, and they took action, but the action has not been sufficient.
So the action they took was what?
The action they took was that they announced that there would be an investigation into the blogger's death.
And fired the cyber police?
That's right. The head of the Tehran head of the cyber police has been fired. As far as we know, no high-ranking members of the security forces or other individuals who have been implicated in this have actually been put on trial. There have been some arrests, but we don't know who these individuals are.
And indeed, the British Foreign Office has sent out a message saying that they're very disappointed that, having taken the initiative to investigate the Iranians, they haven't held anybody accountable. So what should one expect? Well,
what we should expect is for there to be transparent investigations into what actually happened to Sattar Beheshti.
Is it realistic, given the nature of the state of affairs there?
Unfortunately, these types of things have happened before. There have been other bloggers and other individuals, protesters, who were killed in detention facilities following the 2009 elections, and we have seen absolutely no justice come out of the Iranian government. So the next step would really be some sort of independent, international investigation into what has happened with Mr. Sattar Beheshti. And of course, the Iranian government is not willing to allow that type of investigation to go through.
And what about in terms of the crackdown that you've been describing? It's causing a brain drain. It's causing people to flee. I mean, there are figures from the UN which says that, you know, 11,000, 18,000 people are fleeing and seeking asylum through the UNHCR.
That's right. What I would say is that we haven't seen a massive exodus. We don't have a refugee problem the way we do in neighboring Syria or the way we did in Iraq during the height of the conflict. But what we see, as I mentioned before, is a slow strangulation of civil society. We see a very high number of civil society activists who are fleeing. We didn't necessarily see that in the 1980s or the 1990s, but we're starting to see that now, including human rights rights lawyers, by the way, many of whom are currently in prison, including many of the colleagues of Nobel Peace Laureate Shirin Ebadi.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about Nasrin Sotoudeh just after the break.
That's right.
But let me ask you, does pressure work, or does it just put their backs up? Does international pressure work?
I think that international pressure does work to a certain extent. I mean, human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch, for instance, have asked quite often for targeted human rights sanctions against individuals, high-ranking individuals in the security forces, the intelligence forces, who are implicated in very serious human rights violations. And we believe that to a certain extent, those sanctions, those targeted sanctions against those individuals do work. And of course, we're in the business of making sure that the international community understands exactly what is happening in Iran, despite the fact that they don't allow human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch to enter the country and for us to do our research.
You talked about sanctions. There are many complaints from ordinary people out of Iran right now, including human rights activists, that the global sanctions against Iran are hurting the very people that presumably the world doesn't want to hurt, the ordinary people.
That's right. Yes, and I mean, we haven't done a quantitative study of the impact, the humanitarian impact of sanctions, but certainly we hear many of the stories that you and others have heard, that in fact there is a lack of access to medication. Of course, we know there's high inflation and many other things that are really putting a squeeze not only on human rights activists, but the middle class in Iran. We have never called for broad-based sanctions. It's not something that Human Rights Watch does. We have, however, called for targeted human rights sanctions against individuals responsible for human rights violations.
Faraz Sanei, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.